All right. Thank you for joining today. My name is Derek Mueller, and I'm a Senior Research Analyst for the Utah Criminal Justice Center, which is housed in the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. And today we're going to be starting our first session of a three-part series that is going to be with Dr. Chris Sullivan, specifically focusing on taking juvenile justice seriously. Chris is an associate professor at the University of Cincinnati and a leading scholar in the areas of juvenile justice and developmental criminology. He's led several funded and several federal and state funded research projects that have looked at racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, juvenile justice risk and needs assessments, and obviously have implications for juvenile justice reform. These have involved work with law enforcement agencies, juvenile courts, and juvenile correctional agencies in a number of states across the United States. As I mentioned, this series focuses on Chris's book, Taking Juvenile Justice Seriously, which was actually awarded the 2020 Outstanding Contribution Award given by the American Society of Criminology's Division of Developmental and Life Course Criminology. Today, we'll be specifically focusing on the material that's covered in part one of this book. I would also like to thank all of the attendees for being here today. It's such a joy to me to know that so many folks have an interest in the areas of youth development and juvenile justice and how those things kind of relate to policy and practice. I have several real quick requests before I turn things over to Professor Sullivan. Just mindful of your mics setting. Let's refrain from unmuting unless there's an activity or discussion that requires some active participation. I'd also like to note that we're going to try to save some time at the end for some questions. Feel free to submit questions using the chat function as well. We'll try to get to those questions at the end of the event today, but if we do not, we are going to be keeping a log of these and attempt to address these during the panel discussion, which will be held in the final event. I will also do my best to address any unanswered questions at the conclusion of the event series via email. Feel free to email us with any other questions or feedback at ucjc@utah.edu, and please reference the events in the subject line. With that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Chris. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this series. It's thrilling to have so many people participate here, and then as I was told a while ago, also some people who will participate asynchronously or drop into other sessions. And so I'm grateful to everyone at the Utah Criminal Justice Center and the School of Social Work at the University of Utah for putting on this event and for inviting me to participate. It's really quite something to be asked to do this based on a work that you put a lot of time and effort into. I'm really happy to have seen some of the mix of folks that are on today and that will be involved in parts of the series over the next couple of weeks. I think, for me as a researcher and as an academic, I tend to learn the most when being out in the field and just listening oftentimes. So to be able to have a lot of different individuals here to participate and listen to a little bit more distilled version of the book, and then also kind of facilitate some conversation is really a welcome opportunity, especially during a time where we're sort of cut off from a lot of different events and interactions around our work, whether that's conferences or in-person classes and that sort of thing. So this is really great to have this kind of stand-in around the book. I think, as Derek mentioned, we'll do 3 sessions. The first one today will really be a lot of background and kind of covering some different points from early on in the book, which have to do with maybe setting some context that I think is important when we talk about developmental juvenile justice. And then next week, what we'll do is focus a bit more on some evidence-based practice questions in juvenile justice and implementation science research in theory, and kind of taking some of this to the field, and also identifying some obstacles. And then 2 weeks from now, which is great, on Friday, we had a meeting with a few of the folks who will be panelists, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion. And we'll try next week to set up some of the topics that we'll cover in that third week. As Derek mentioned, I think it's really, this is really an opportunity to have a conversation as well. And so while I'm leading this and going through the material, I'm more than happy to, have questions posed, and that way we can cover them, if not today, over the span of the next 3 weeks or 3 sessions. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this works out okay. Just to get us started, incidentally, all the materials will be made available after the session, so you'll have them to go through as well at your leisure, especially if there's pieces that I don't get to in the now 54 minutes or so that we have. So what I wanted to do. And I'm hoping everyone's seeing this. Is it Derek? Okay, give me a nod, Derek. Thank you. Okay, so this kind of just goes into some of the material we just talked about. I won't belabor that anymore. But again, I am grateful, so grateful to the group there at the University of Utah who have been working with me on planning this and have been involved and who have developed these series, which I think are really fantastic idea. Ideally, we have a lot of people on the, in the session today, so we can't really go around and have everyone introduce themselves, but, you at least got to know me, and hopefully as time goes on, we'll be able to hear some more from you, and I'll get to know you a little bit as well. And I mentioned this already. And so, I like to, when I'm talking about delinquency and thinking about how do we explain delinquency, both at the case level and then also at the broader level, like to sort of think about different types in terms of understanding individual cases and the response to that. I think that's partly where we are now in juvenile justice in terms of using an awful lot of assessment procedures and systematic assessments. And I think one of the things, though, is that we need to realize that those types aren't pure forms, and we need to be thinking a lot about the variability that we encounter in the juvenile justice system. And to me, when I think about the system, and when I first sat down to write this book, it really started in some ways, or one of the earlier pieces that really resonated with me was I was in a county in mid-sized county in Ohio, and talking with someone who basically oversaw programming for that juvenile court. And she and I were sitting there having a conversation mainly about racial and ethnic disparities. But one of the things that she was pointing out is just the fact that the court didn't have much choice over the youth who were coming to it. And so they basically had to handle all kinds of cases across the spectrum, different types of needs, different types of risks, some who were apt to be there once and then never come back, some others that maybe had been involved multiple previous times as well. And so that was really a resonant point for me early on as I thought a lot about this, and then started to think about what we could do in bringing developmental insight into our understanding of the juvenile justice system, maybe in a slightly different way than what had been seen previously. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what I want to do, hopefully this will work, is I want to just show you a case to begin with.
5 high school students in Michigan are accused of throwing rocks off an man. Kenneth White was 32 years old. He was a father of 4 children. He was riding home last week when a rock hit and killed him. The 5 suspects are 15 to 17 years old. They are all charged with second-degree murder. Adriana Diaz is at the Genesee County Jail in Flint, Michigan, where the oldest suspect is being held. Adriana, good morning.
Good morning. The teenager who prosecutors believe actually dropped the rock is 17-year-old Kyle Anger. He's the one being held here at the county jail. The others are at a juvenile detention facility. They were all arraigned yesterday and are being tried as adults. The 5 teenage defendants were expressionless as their lawyers entered not guilty pleas for them.
My client has no criminal record whatsoever.
Their distraught families watched the proceedings. So did the grieving father of Kenneth White, the 32-year-old victim.
I buried my mother, my father, and my oldest brother in the last 4 years, and this is the hardest thing I've ever did in my life.
Police say White, a construction worker, was getting a ride home in a Ford Econoline van around 8:30 p.m. last Wednesday. That's when a 6-pound rock, about 5 inches wide and 8 inches long, was allegedly dropped from an overpass and crashed through the windshield. The father of 4 was struck in the face and chest. He was declared dead on arrival at the hospital.
It's not a prank, it's second-degree murder.
Officials say after the incident, the suspects went to McDonald's. Investigators say they found at least 20 rocks on Interstate 75. One weighed more than 20 pounds. Frank Manley and Fred Myers represent 2 of the defendants, Mark Zakelski and Trevor Gray. How's your client doing?
Scared. He feels devastated for the victim and the family.
I think there's been a public rush to accept that these kids are bad, that they're almost animalistic, and they should be punished as such.
Your Honor, Mr. Mueller understands the serious nature of the charges he's facing.
The suspects face up to life in prison, but Kenny White Sr., the victim's father, says that's not enough.
Even if they spend 30 years in prison, they get to wake up every single morning. They still get phone calls from their parents. They still get visitors. My son don't get none of that no more. That was taken away from him for something stupid.
Investigators believe the suspects also dropped a tire and car engine parts from another overpass nearby, damaging other vehicles. They were denied bail and are due back in court November 2nd. Nora?
Really disturbing story, Adriana. Thank you.
Okay. So, that's an example of one case or a series of cases, connected cases that the juvenile justice system has dealt with. And so that's kind of a relatively, extreme example of the type of case. But then, I think we can also look at other cases. And so these profiles that I'll show you here are from court observations that we did in association with a study a few years ago. And the first case was a truancy case, repeated truancy. The youth had poor school performance. Their mother was in court, and they had relatively little additional risk beyond this school performance issue, and then also the truancy that was related to it. And then another case that we saw in the same observation, the same court, was a youth with a concealed weapons case. Prior history of delinquency. They were accompanied by her parent and an appointed public defender. They had a drug and alcohol problem. They were in detention. And what had happened here was that there was a kind of back and forth between parents' houses, so mom and dad's house. The living situation, relationship, and supervision was questionable, at least in terms of what the probation officer had relayed in the both in the court hearing and also in their predisposition report. So the first question we have, and I think Christian, if I'm not mistaken, is going to drop that into the chat as well. Is, based on the scenarios that I just showed, what are some important factors in making decisions about these cases to you? And so, we just kind of want to get a sense for the range of different types of factors that would play a role in terms of how decisions might be made about these different cases. So I'll give a couple minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just to get some of those in the chat, and then look a little bit at those. Okay, so we're seeing, risk to reoffend. What was the youth's intent? So, getting some sense of where and why this might have happened. Delinquency history, seriousness of previous offenses. Do they have any protective factors? Evaluations done based on previous offenses. Age is certainly one that we're often thinking about in the juvenile justice system. Family and mental health, developmental maturity. So trying to get maybe some insight into where the youth or youths are at developmentally, any strengths they might have. Again, some more intent and whether this was premeditated, whether they have natural support. So, are there individuals or connections maybe to the community or to school or to family that would be useful to have some knowledge of, family circumstances, the supports that they might be available to, their response to the situation. That's one that comes up quite a bit. I think we definitely see that in looking at court hearings, particularly with youth, is trying to get a sense of how they're processing what they've done and what the implications of that are. The victim and the victim's family, certainly we'd want to factor in potentially as well. So what we see there is that there's a whole host of factors really that could come into play that we'd want to be mindful of. And those can be things that are immediate, right, that are related to the situation. Some of them are, as was brought up, they're related maybe to the history of the youth. Some of them are about whether or not they have supports that might have helped or may help them going forward, perhaps in sort of changing course. Others of them are about their mindset and how they respond to that event. And I would say that a lot of these things that are brought up, are both aspects of the scenario and of the individual youth, but also they have some developmental underpinnings and then also some developmental implications. So when we start thinking about, for example, risk of reoffending, and that's coming into kind of our decision making, well, then one of the questions becomes, well, how are we judging that? Can we make those assessments that give us a good sense of what's going to happen in the future, especially with youth who are still developing? And so I think all of these answers are interesting. And I think one of the things that's interesting about them is both that they can be pertinent in all of these kind of range of offenses in different ways, but some of them will have a bit more emphasis depending on the situation, perhaps. And so that's something that really signals to us that the system is balancing the nature of the offense. And certainly that's true in the adult system as well. But also the system is very interested in looking at the youth, their ability to sort of be redirected and supported going forward. So that idea of supports came up, protective factors, strengths came up in the chat and responding to that question. So all of those, I think, are important pieces. And I would argue that a lot of them will fit under a developmental framework. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is just basically what we'll cover over the, the 3-week panel or the 3-week process. And I sort of mentioned a number of these in my starting comments. But I think what we want to do is, I think one thing that's interesting and important to point out is that when we think developmentally, we can think both about some sanctions and then treatment. I think we really need to consider practical implications of a lot of this research, and then thinking about some of the complexities which really just came up a bit in the chat in the response to that initial question. And so I think we'll get a lot of that from the questions that emerge from our discussion and from my presenting this material, and then also the week 3 panel especially will bring a lot of those to the fore as well. So just to kind of give you a sense of at least from my standpoint, where I've seen a lot of the evolution of juvenile justice research, and I've really been involved in kind of applied research in juvenile justice since the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago now, when I was involved in a diversion project in the state of New York and managed a lot of the research process for that project. But beginning in about 2009, late 2009, 2010, more and more discussion started to come about in terms of developmental implications or developmental research in the juvenile justice system. So you see this Elizabeth Scott and a Lawrence Steinberg book, which came out in 2009, Rethinking Juvenile Justice, in which they used a lot of the recent developmental research that had predominantly taken place in psychology, including even some lab type studies that looked at peer relationships and impacts. They looked at a lot of the emerging brain science and looked at how that could inform juvenile justice. In my view, one of the things that they focused a lot on, though, was just kind of the distinction between child and adolescent sort of jurisdiction of the juvenile court and then the adult system. And so it was kind of about, all right, well, what are the implications for how we treat kids broadly? And then Reforming Juvenile Justice, this is a National Academy of Sciences report that came out in 2013. And that, I think, expanded the lens a bit into the juvenile justice system more formally. But again, I think that predominantly one of the, it was still sort of that same vein in terms of the, a heavy focus on a lot of the psychology literature. And one of the things that became apparent to me is that there was an awful lot that we were learning from research in crime and justice settings that would be applicable here. And so part of the impetus for me writing and doing this work over the last few years was really to try to bring that and implement that, or integrate that, into into that discussion. And I think another point was that at times I thought there was maybe a little bit they stopped at the water's edge in terms of how challenging some of this would be in terms of the implementation process. And so again, another motivation here was to try to make sure that we had some coverage of that as well. And so again, we're not going to dwell on this, but these will be some points that we'll cover over the next couple of sessions. So thinking about a more developmental juvenile justice system from the standpoint of developmental life course criminology, so the study of crime and delinquency over time, but also thinking about contemporary juvenile justice practice, and then the research on effective sanctions and effective treatment, and then the implementation context will be important as well. So again, it was really meant to bring all of these points together, which relate to some of the understanding of juvenile justice, implementation in the juvenile justice setting, which is really, as I know many of you work in the juvenile justice setting. It's a multifaceted sort of environment where, we have network service providers. The system's loosely coupled at times. There are multiple objectives that are often at work. And so really trying to think about how to implement some of this knowledge in that context. So that will be a really important element of what we'll discuss. When we start talking about developmental juvenile justice or even developmental criminology more generally, oftentimes we start with the age crime curve as a starting point. And so, one of the things that's very clear is that we have sort of, however we look at it, and it's been looked at a lot over time, we do tend to see the same general kind of shape and progression. So this is some data from a few years ago on the right-hand panel, and then some data from the 80s on the left-hand panel from a review by David Farrington. And essentially what we see is that while there are some differences, I think we could say now that because of maybe the elongation of adolescence and sort of early adulthood and changes there, there's been a little bit of a kind of expansion of that window outward. But the same general shape tends to occur where there's a lot of delinquency and criminal behavior in adolescence. And then that tends to fall off in adulthood. And so whenever we're thinking developmentally, this is one place certainly to start in framing our discussion of how the age and crime relationship tends to work. And that is, sort of at the fore of why we have separate systems to begin with. And so it's worth keeping in mind that this has roughly remained the same over time. But within that, there's some different elements that are important, and we'll unpack that a few times at a few points in today's discussion. But there's definitely different age and delinquency patterns, and so the idea of getting into some of the developmental and life course work around delinquency and around criminal behavior really gets us into different permutations or different categorizations that could come up. And so the idea of chronic and serious offenders, and this is really what we saw a lot of in the 90s in terms of the the notion that there was a hardcore group of offenders and it was growing, and they would consistently challenge the ability of society to control and constrain crime. And so this is really frequently referenced in calls for enhanced penalties, and then also in reaching some individual case judgments. But one of the things we do know is that most youth are non-chronic offenders and have no serious violent offenses. And so the group that falls into that category is relatively small. And so one of the questions is, how do we really deal with the entire population of youth that are involved in the juvenile justice system effectively, when sometimes those patterns that we see over time can be masked in the immediate case. So we may not see that total pattern as we encounter a youth who's maybe 14 years old and is involved in the system. We don't know kind of exactly. We can assess and try to figure out what happened before that encounter, and then we can kind of try to assess to determine what might happen going forward. But it still is an imperfect process to do that. And so again, looking at delinquency and the prior history, so showing this in another way, which I kind of like to, use this illustration. This is from the Philadelphia Pathways to Desistance sample. So this is a group of youth who are involved with the juvenile justice system. And I know that this is a non-student audience. I'm hoping that you get my Simpsons references here. But what we see is that, there's a 21% of the group had zero prior juvenile court cases. So this was their first involvement. And here we have kind of this adolescent kind of risky behavior and fighting, but not necessarily behavior that would be chronic or observed over time. Then we do see that there are 1 to 2 prior offenses, and so moderate delinquency in this sample. And you can see that from the 3 to 5 range was about 30% of this sample. And again, this was a sample of youth who were petitioned in the court and adjudicated. And so this is, you know, a sample with significant, relatively significant system involvement. And then you can see this 8% group, which is the more serious in terms of their prior court cases, 6 or more, and that's about 8%. And so again, this is just meant to illustrate that when we think about the pathways to the system, even in this sample of system-involved youth, there are an awful lot of cases and a lot of variability in terms of what the system is going to encounter as far as those cases on one element, which is this prior delinquency history, and an element that came up a lot when we talked about how we might make decisions about the cases that we used as kind of examples at the start of the talk. And so I think one of the things that's really important is that there's a lot of layers of variation that need to be dealt with. And so I think that developmental insight can help in dealing with that variation. And so that's kind of one of the thesis points that I have in the work that basically I'm presenting here, and the work that went into that to the book. So we're really kind of putting together this puzzle. As we saw, right, there were a lot of different vantage points from which we could make decisions about the cases that we used as kind of a leaping off point. And some of them, as was mentioned, were related to the youth's history. Some were related to their prospects for change. Some were related to maybe the social circumstances in which the offense occurred. Some of them were related to their mindset. But all of that variety kind of comes into play and makes it really complex to sort of pull that together and then make effective decisions. And then I think another element is that that information is often incomplete. We don't know and can't project perfectly, what's going to happen if we choose one option versus another. And so that's really important for us to keep in mind as we try to use research insights to help inform as well as possible system decisions. And then also as we're using more general insights on how we might deal with cases that come into the juvenile court. And so the juvenile justice system today, just kind of want to point this out, and I'll come back to this, especially next week, but it basically handled approximately 75,000 cases, 750,000 cases in 2018. That is quite a decline. I think we're all aware of the declining trends in terms of the juvenile justice system. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk a bit about kind of the implications of those declines. One of the things we do see is that there are still an awful lot of cases that are formally petitioned, so about 55%. And then from there, youth can proceed down several paths. And those have both different sort of precipitating profiles in terms of why they would go down those paths, including, again, a number of the factors that came up in the poll. And then they also have a lot of different developmental implications, right? And so the choices that are made within the system have some developmental implications as well that we want to be mindful of. And then there's also sort of a developmental trajectory that would get a youth to the system. And so ultimately what ends up happening is the system is going to have to balance sanction and treatment effectively. And I think that that's just kind of a fundamental premise of juvenile justice especially. And so we talk about crime and justice policy, and I think this is one useful aspect of the very useful aspect of the Scott and Steinberg work that I referenced earlier, is really to put the response to youth delinquency in context. And so crime and justice policy is really only one aspect of kind of the regulatory or legal response to children and adolescents. And so, you know, I think if we think about it broadly, one of the goals of laws that are related to restrictions on minors and special protections is to promote children's welfare and to facilitate positive development. So the idea of, for example, legal or restrictions on legal drinking age, driving restrictions, and other factors that are meant to be protectionary in how they deal with and regulate youth. That's really, a driving force behind the legal system in terms of how it deals with childhood and adolescence more generally, but then also does factor into juvenile justice too. And I think one of the things that's interesting when we start to think about how we do juvenile justice is to contextualize it in these other systems. And I think that's what one of the reasons or one of the entry points that has been used in a lot of the recent inclination to make the juvenile justice system more developmental. And so Zimring talks about this adolescence as a learner's permit, right? So some restrictions are lifted, but then others are maintained or at the very least kind of phased out over time, so that the youth has some ability to develop and make mistakes, but also not be paying for them for the rest of their lives. Now, this gets complicated when we start to bring in juvenile justice because, as we saw, right, in that early case where the big rock was dropped on the car, that was someone's life was lost, and so the implications sometimes of the behavior can be quite problematic, even if it may be sort of linked to the adolescent social environment. The outcome and the implications can be quite severe. So this idea of adolescence as a learner's permit is one justification. And so again, this was a justification that is really important in terms of the development of the juvenile court. And I think that one of the points that's really important is that the developmental research that we've recently had on children really make that, and adolescents really make that more precise. So the developmental neuroscience that we now have, or some of the social psychology that we have of adolescent decision-making, and a lot of that insight really formalizes some things that the court's original developers kind of had intuition about and really had in mind when they wanted to form this system. And again, I think that that's sort of is important just to reflect on and understand, because even things like assessment, we've been doing in some form for, since the onset of the juvenile court. They've just kind of evolved in terms of how the systems work and how they're applied now. And so this developmental research, given the early the early foundations of the court, really that developmental research is sort of naturally able and in place to potentially inform juvenile justice policy and practice. But I do think it's really important, and this is something that comes back to us, especially researchers as we're sort of out in the field, is that it's never going to be the only information point that's used, but it can be potentially insightful. And so I think hopefully over the next couple of weeks, especially when we get into weeks 2 and 3, we'll kind of have maybe some idea of where this information might place alongside other things that are going to be important in decision making, and really how to contextualize a lot of the insights that come from developmental research in criminology and psychology, sociology, brain science, and so forth. And so when we talk about development in juvenile justice decision making, there are a couple of different ways in which this can occur. And again, I think that the answers that came up in relation to those cases speak to these ideas of justice-involved youth and notions of choice and character, or sometimes what's referred to as offense and offender. And so I think that these decisions in handling individual cases are going to really involve considering both. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the mix of those things can differ in the juvenile justice system versus the criminal justice system, for example. But there's really going to be some consideration of both. And so the idea of developmental research in terms of how it might inform broadly juvenile justice decision-making is that on the one hand, choices are going to be constrained by developmental features. And that could be things like reward sensitivity. So youth being kind of having this elevated, and adolescents having this elevated kind of attraction to reward, and then the capacity for self-regulation, maybe not keeping up with that. And then also the notion of, when we talk about character, this not yet fully formed identity or character. And those 2 points really underpin the recent developmental research in terms of how it's informed juvenile justice. And so when we look at developmental research on choice, there's an interaction inherently between a youth and their social environment. And Scott and Steinberg and Kaufman and Steinberg lay this out quite nicely. There's one piece that's obviously the youth's thinking. There's a psychosocial, so how are they embedded sort of in their environment and how are they interacting with their social environment? And there's also sort of biological imperatives that are at least in some ways affecting kind of what's happening in that interaction between the youth and their environment. And so that recent developmental research is one place where we see that these factors are potentially affecting how a youth is going to get into both a situation where there may be elevated likelihood of delinquency and or also how they're going to act in that situation as well. And so both those elements come into play when we think about the interaction of the individual youth and their social environment. And I think, again, astutely, that that comes up in a lot of the answers that were given in terms of how we respond to these cases. Some of them were about how the offense occurred once the youth was in that situation, and then others maybe how the social influences might have affected their presence there too. I think one of the major points that we're seeing in the recent research in terms of adolescence and adulthood is the idea of the brain development research. And this is sort of an example from UCLA lab, but we definitely see a lot of this type of research, and we can kind of identify a lot of these figures where the loss of gray matter over time and the cortical development that goes along. And so what ends up happening is we see as the youth moves from adolescence, early adolescence to adulthood, we start to see that maturation occurring in the brain. And so that's one element of basically what Kaufman and Steinberg and colleagues are talking about when considering brain development. So those shifts in colors really nicely show that evolution over time. We also know that the susceptibility to peer influence is shifting. And so this heightened reward sensitivity, a really interesting experiment that was carried out by Gardner and Steinberg in 2005, put youth in a lab, and then also different other age groups as well, and had them interact in that lab with a risky situation, a risky driving situation with and without peers. And one of the things they noticed is that the differential effects over age or between ages or age groups that really had an impact on the degree to which a youth would respond with kind of a more risky choice to really speed up through a changing light, for example, versus slow down and brake. And so, I think that one of the things that's really important, we talk about peer influence, however, is that it's an awful lot more complicated than just kind of our maybe standard stereotype of peer pressure might be. So I think, many of us probably, if we're involved in, indiscretions in adolescence and that we're found out by our parents, might sort of point to our friends and say that we were influenced by them and that, peer pressure was involved. as kind of a way of, maybe diminishing our responsibility. I think that certainly there's some truth to that notion of peer pressure, but it's definitely more complicated when we dig below the surface. And I think that the book tries to get into some of that and the ways in which that peer influence can work, because there's a few different mechanisms. There is the idea of just us being in kind of routine situations where we're kids, and there's some perhaps boredom and desire to go along to to kind of get along and to show loyalty and other mechanisms that can govern adolescent social behavior. And then there's also effects where certain kids are likely to gravitate towards one another and reinforce one another's behavior, and that may be another element. And so there's a few different ways in which this influence can play out, but it's often more complicated, especially when we start to look at it developmentally, than a strict kind of peer pressure model would suggest. And then, so if we move from choice, and choice again being part of the social environment that's sort of interacting with a youth's potentially disposition towards risk and reward sensitivity, we can also get into the idea of character. And incidentally, one of the things that when we look at a lot of the ways in which this is manifested, and I don't really have time to get into it too much, but I'm hoping that you're maybe somewhat familiar with a lot of the Supreme Court cases that kind of came out of this research and I think brought it to the fore, around youth life imprisonment, and Roper v. Simmons, which dealt with the death penalty for offenses that were committed before a youth reached the age of adulthood. And so a lot of this was brought up in those Supreme Court decisions in ways that essentially started to, I think, move that a little bit more into the legal system and some of the legal arguments, and probably in a lot of ways helped make this a bit more commonplace in the juvenile justice system as well. And so I think the idea of character, we basically are making these assessments, attributions and appraisals about youths. And one of the things that again came up in our first poll question, was this idea of like, we're trying to make some determination about why this behavior is happening. And then we're also simultaneously really looking at the future potential. Will this youth kind of change direction with a nudge maybe from the system, or maybe with more overt intervention that would be maybe a bit more intensive? Do they have maybe supports that can help with their redirection maybe towards a different kind of course of development? And so the idea of character, I think, is somewhat vague. It does involve this appraisal, both of the reasons for the youth being in the court, being in the juvenile justice system, and then also their future potential as well. But it does point to a series of kind of acts and beliefs, decisions, attributions that are maybe occurring where there's a relatively stable kind of identity that's developing. And I think one of the things that we definitely see in the research on identity development is that's still occurring in interaction with a youth's environment, and it's still occurring into adulthood. And so one example, and this research goes back to Kohlberg and Erickson and an awful lot of child development research on identity that's really decades old at this point. But basically, the idea that the capacity for moral reasoning and who you are is still growing and still kind of unfolding in adolescence. And so, that capacity is going to be used to a greater degree in decision making as someone gets older. And so, this idea of character is another place that developmental research comes into play as well. So, this individuation, where adolescents are still figuring things out. There's still this kind of instability that's happening. And I think, one of the things that we see, one of the examples that I like to use with classes at times is really this idea of students starting with a clear sense of their college major or not, and we definitely see oftentimes evolution in terms of what people want to do as they get older, and so to some extent that's part of a broader process of individuation where youth are still figuring things out. And then I think that this idea of the individuation process and the identity development process is going to be interactive and involves some degree of behavioral exploration. So again, some of this is not fixed yet. And I think where the system comes in oftentimes and where social supports come in is that the reaction to that exploration becomes important. Now, again, I think that the justice system, the juvenile justice system, is in a unique place from the standpoint of having that mission of protecting the community, but also sort of taking into account best interests of youth and trying to be real rehabilitative, and that can be somewhat that can be a little bit difficult in this sense, because the reaction to that behavior is going to be important in terms of further individuation, in terms of how that identity develops. And the fact that that's not a stable thing yet, but by the same token, the juvenile justice system is going to have to, take account, for example, as we saw earlier, of the seriousness of the offense, of the prior history as well. And so there's some considerations for practice, the implications for competence, and so this gets into whether or not a youth can be involved in assisting with their own defense, understanding the charges and process. That tends to be, I think, some of the focus of the earlier developmental literature and research as it was relevant to the juvenile justice system, and then also the adult system as well. But I think most of for me, most of the focus is always in the implications for sanction and treatment in the juvenile justice system. And so they've maybe engaged in an act that led to harm, but then also will be affected by their experience in the juvenile justice system. And then there's a short and long-term perspective that comes into play as well. When we start talking about the learner's permit view of adolescence, and this is where there's some skepticism, and I'm happy to speak to some of that in Q&A in one of these sessions. But one of the things we do see, to some extent, is that while this plot is from the book, but one of the things that's meant to illustrate in some sense is that these are overlapping. There definitely is some growth over time in terms of the impulse control for youth, but they are still kind of within the same range. And so one of the questions is then, how do you approach making individual and case level and categorical decisions from the standpoint of the juvenile justice system? And so this is something sometimes that people will bring up as a limitation of this learner's permit view. So in addition, maybe to the potential harm that's caused through certain delinquent acts, there's also sort of enough overlap in variability for these things that are happening that also there might be more closeness between someone who's age 16 and age 20 versus they're different. So they're more alike than different in some people's estimation, and that sort of gets into, to some extent, the perception and perspective that people have. But we can definitely come back to that, and there's be some instances where that will come up in next week's discussion, and then I think in week 3 as well. Okay. I see that I only have a few minutes left. I think what I might do then is stop here and kind of pick this up next week, just because I want to give us a moment to do the poll question. and then we can come back to this next week. I also don't want to keep anyone. I know this is many people's lunch hour, so I don't want to keep you over 1 o'clock either. So I think Christian has a second poll question for you. And I think, one of the things that this question here is getting at is to what extent and what are some initial ideas of things that might be developmental in nature that are also kind of practical actions or practical interventions even that occur in the juvenile justice system. And this will kind of be used as a springboard into our discussion next week as well. So what are some examples or practices or approaches that could be used at different stages of the juvenile justice system that could potentially be developmental in nature? So I see diversion opportunities, certainly. Yep. Diversion or formal processing will have some developmental implications. Yep. Right. So I see wraparound services to keep youth in their homes and communities. Yep, certainly. Okay. Christian notes the age of individuals in the juvenile justice system should be higher, and we'll definitely touch on that one next week. Developmental differences between boys and girls' needs. Yep. Assessment services. Developmental neuroscience in policy and practice. I see teen and young adult courts. Those are interesting, interesting potential manifestations of kind of developmental insight, because if we think about teen courts as a potential option as far as giving youth investment and responsibility in these scenarios, that's a potentially interesting developmental implication or application. Yeah, so there's a number of them here. And what we'll do is kind of go through a number of different points in the juvenile justice system and juvenile justice process next week and talk a little bit about some of the evidence-based practices, but then also get into at least a little bit on some of the implementation challenges as well, so that we can really assess not only kind of what the research is telling us, but then also maybe some of the challenges that can come up in putting this research into practice effectively. And in turn, that hopefully will kind of balance what we're learning from the research and sort of theory of development with what we would be able to actually implement effectively, or being aware of the potential challenges in developing implementation strategy that's going to be maximize and be as effective as possible. So what I'll do is open it up here if anyone has any final questions or Q&A they want to put in the chat. I know that Derek and Christian and I will basically pull the information from the chat and keep these questions. So if we don't touch on them today, I can either kind of bring them up next week as they're pertinent, and or we're going to use them to kind of seed the panel discussion that will happen in a couple of weeks as well, with a number of key individuals from the Utah State juvenile justice system and sort of policy making process. So I'll sign off there, and if I'm going to stick around for a little bit and answer questions if you have them. But otherwise, I'm hoping to see. I see addressing trauma earlier and better just coming into. That's a really important point when we start to think about developmental insight and the juvenile justice system. All right. I see one on the from the book as well. Yeah, yeah. So this will definitely be a point that we'll address. So the question in the chat is about formulating new policies have to consider the pressures on juvenile justice systems and their stakeholders, both existing pressures and those brought by change, and how those pressures affect implementing and sustaining proposed reforms. So I'll definitely, we'll talk about that next week for sure. Actually, the first poll question that I have for next week will be directly relevant to that point, and really getting some insight into what folks, especially those in the field, see as some of the challenges with all of this. And I'm certainly of the mind that, if we're not sort of aware and responsive to those challenges with implementation up front, it can be really difficult to actually move anything that's emerging from research into the field. And I think we see that and have seen that over and over again in our studies from situations where we'll go in and talk to individuals who are implementing new assessment systems, and they basically will tell us that this is the third different assessment system we've had over 10 years. Can we just pick one and stick with it and get to a point where we've developed expertise in it? And so I think that there's a balance of trying to engage in effective practice, but then also being mindful of the strain and the pressure that puts on. And so I think we can definitely talk about that for sure next week, and then we'll talk about that in our group discussion in week 3 as well. And I think that will be even more informative because we'll have some people on the panel that are really heavily involved in that exact thing, is trying to take some of this evidence and bring it into the field effectively. All right, so thank you again for being involved. Really appreciate it, and thanks to the group at the Utah Criminal Justice Center. And hopefully we'll see everyone next week and get into a bit more of conversation. Again, all of these slides will be available, and I will highlight a few of the ones at the end of this set next week, but then we'll definitely get into some new material next week as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for attending, and we hope to see you all next week.